Art Buchwald is one of the funniest men writing in American newspapers today. His 3 times a week column, syndicated to more than 300 newspapers here and abroad, is a gentle blend of whimsy and satire, a mirror image of America, slightly distorted, that reveals much about us, perhaps too much, but does it in a manner that eases the pain of recognition with laughter. It all began in Paris. He was the innocent abroad, reporting on everyone's favorite city. He soon became everyone's favorite columnist. In 1962, he gave up the pleasures of Paris and established himself in Washington, from where he has continued to observe, with his singular viewpoint, the fantasy land of politics. In addition to a dozen books which have been compiled from his columns, the most recent is I Never Danced at the White House, he's also written a successful Broadway play, Sheep on the Runway.
Art, 20 years ago, you said one of the hardest things I find is to interview a beautiful woman when she has her legs crossed. Do you still feel that way 20 years later?
Yeah.
It hasn't changed, huh?
No, I hope it never does. But I don't interview beautiful women with their legs crossed anymore. That was when I was in Paris, and I did a lot more interviewing then and writing about women whose legs were crossed. But I don't do that so much anymore. First, I can't think of too many women in government who would turn me on if they did cross their legs. And secondly, I don't interview anybody. So I guess it's inoperative in terms of what I'm doing, but not in terms of my thoughts.
One more quotation, this more recent. When you say that you described yourself as a man constantly fulfilling his childhood dreams of glory.
Right.
What were those childhood dreams of glory?
Well, I was a foster child. I was raised in a series of foster homes.
Your mother died when you were quite young,
I was
did she
born, and I was put in a series of homes, and at a very early age, you go into fantasy when things aren't going the way you want to. In fact, most of the people that are in creative work are people who might have had unhappy childhoods who went into fantasy very early. And I guess my fantasy was that I was going to be the person I am today, and I was going to show everybody. I didn't know I was going to be a newspaper columnist, but I was determined to show all the people who looked at me as a foster child, which is kind of a little less than you look at somebody else. There's something wrong with being a foster child. You don't know exactly what it is, but
you don't feel fully accepted, I suppose.
You don't feel fully accepted. You don't belong. You're in sort of a no man's land, and you live in deathly fear first that people are going to find out that you're a foster child, which is there's some sort of a shame involved with it, which is rather tragic, but it's true, and you're different than other kids. And so at an early age, you build up a certain anger and hostility. Now, some people can turn this into, well, not some, but a few people can turn this into humor, which I did at a very early age.
You did turn it into humor yourself.
I did. It came naturally to me.
As a protection, I suppose. Huh?
It was protection. I found out that I could make people laugh. Now, I found out in public school I could make the other kids laugh, and I could do it at the expense of the teacher and the principal, which was authority. So at a very early age, I was constantly going for laughs. And this was my way of getting accepted. And my dreams during all those years, because I was sort of a loner, was to be, you know, just what I'm doing now. And people writing to me, the people that kind of looked down on me and said, we remember you, and we remember how we used to help you with your work and how we encourage you. Well, it's all balderdash. Nobody did. But they like to think they did. And I let them think it.
There were 4 in your family. You were the only boy, but there are 3
I had
girls.
3 sisters.
Yes. But you didn't stay together then. You were split up in foster homes.
Yeah, my younger sister and I were in one home, and my other sisters were in others.
So you had no real family life in the traditional sense.
We didn't have a family life, but strange enough, we were very cohesive. We weren't too far away from each other in terms of geography, and my father visited us every weekend. And we've remained a very close family in spite of the fact that we didn't have what would be a normal upbringing. And it's amazing that we have been able to remain so close together when I see other families where they did live together and they don't talk to each other. We're very close, and maybe the experience brought us closer together.
What about your father's influence? Was it minimal since he wasn't with you in those, very much of the time in those very early years?
Yeah, I wasn't, no, my father did not influence me to any great extent, mainly because he wasn't there.
You did feel pretty much alone then.
And I was more influenced by women than I was by men. The foster mothers in the homes I was in were much stronger people than the men. And I guess they had more of an effect, plus my three sisters who were all older than me and all wanted to be my mother. So
the family did get together, I gather, when you were 16. And
we all took an apartment together, and we were together at that point. And then I went off to the Marine Corps. And
did you go off to the Marine Corps partly because you were overly mothered by your sisters, as one writer
Well, I was 16 years old, and I wasn't happy with anything. And fortunately, there was a war on. And therefore, I could run away and join the Marines, and it was rather a heroic gesture. I think if there was no war on, I don't know what the heck I would have done, but I doubt if I would have stayed around. But that was just my own.
But you did it as a heroic gesture, something that...
Well, I don't know if I did it as a heroic gesture. I did it because it was the thing to do, but I knew it would look like a heroic gesture. So I didn't... I knew that going into the Marine Corps was a very socially acceptable thing, just like humor. The things that I've always gone for are the sociably acceptable things, how they look to the other side. Now, fortunately, these things merge together, and where it's to your benefit and it's also socially acceptable, then you're home free.
Right. How did you get in the Marine Corps at 16?
Well, I went down to see an old girlfriend of mine that I'd met that summer at a place where I worked in Mount Washington, New Hampshire, as a bellboy. And I fell in love with this girl, and she was down in Greensboro, North Carolina. So I went down to see her to say goodbye in this heroic gesture I was talking about. Well, she had a guy from VMI visiting her that weekend, so it didn't work so well, the gesture. And so in disgust, I said, oh, the heck with it. And I went over to the post office, and I said, I want to join the Marine Corps. And he said, well, how old are you? And I said, 17. He said, well, you need your father's consent. And I said, well, he's in town buying feed now, and just give me the papers, he'll sign them. And he said, they have to be notarized. And I said, fine. So I took the papers out in the street, and I didn't know what I was going to do, and it was in kind of a slum area of Greensboro, and this old grizzled man came up to me and asked me for a dime for a drink. And I said, I will not only give you a dime, but I'll give you a half a pint of whiskey if you do something for me. He said, what's that? He said, I want you to be my father for an hour so I can join the Marine Corps. And he thought about it for 10 seconds, and he says, why, that's patriotic. And so I took this old drunken man up to the notary, and I was thinking pretty good, I must admit. And I said to the notary, can I speak to you alone? He says, yeah. And I said, my father's been drunk for a month, and I've been trying to get in the Marine Corps. Would you have any objection if I held his hand while I signed his name? And the notary said, anything for a boy going into the Marine Corps. So I held his hand, and I signed my father's name to the papers, and the notary stamped it, and I gave the old drunk a half pint of whiskey, and I was in the Marine Corps.
You stayed in the Marine Corps for something like 3.5 years, didn't you?
Yeah, 3.5 years, and I was fine. I wasn't in any real danger. I was in an air wing, and so it wasn't that.
But he was in the Pacific doing.
It was in the Pacific, and I was young enough not to know what I was doing, which is the best time to be in the Marine Corps. And but I had a good time, you know. And
you loved the Marine Corps, as a matter of fact, didn't you?
Well, as I say, there's another fantasy: a guy in uniform walking down the street, and you know, it was a great fantasy because I saw enough movies about the Marines, and I had the glamour. Yeah, I did like the Marines, strangely enough, because it was sort of the first time I had a real father.
Really?
Oh, yeah.
So they cared about you, and you cared about them.
Yeah, the Marines or the service, for a lot of people, do become a father image. People don't realize that. And then I got discharged from the Marines. I didn't have a high school diploma, so I decided to go to night high school to make up the credits. And I went down to the University of Southern California because I was discharged out there, and I got in line to find out what I needed. By the time I got to the desk, they were so confused that they enrolled me in the school. And so I was going to college.
Without a high school diploma?
Without a high school diploma. A year later, they called me in. They said, "You don't have a high school diploma." I said, "I know." I was doing the work. So they said, "Well, we'll make you a special student." I said, "Fine." And I went in 3 years and had a ball.
What did you study at USC? What was your ambition at this point?
Anything I wanted, because at that time there were so many students in the school that the required courses were 200 or 300 or 500 people. So I just went down the catalog and took things I wanted. I took several courses from Baxter, Shakespeare, and things like that. And I took what I wanted because I knew I didn't need anything. I wasn't going for a degree. And I would.
What were you going for?
I just liked going to college. It was fun. And I was writing for the magazine. I was editor of the magazine, the Humor magazine. I was writing a column for the newspaper. I was writing the variety show. And it was just great, you know. So I don't know what I was going for, but I was having a good time.
When did you first begin to write, Art?
Well, very early in the game, in high school, and I was always writing humor, even in those days. And then I wrote in the Marine Corps, and I wrote at the University of Southern California. And then in 1948, I heard you could go to Paris on the GI Bill of Rights. And this sounded like a better deal than Southern California. So I had a check from New York State for $250 that they gave the veterans, and I took the check and I bought a one-way ticket to Paris. And
you'd never been to Paris before?
Oh, no, but you know, it was sort of the Mecca for writers, Hemingway, everybody, so.
And you were determined to be a writer at this point?
I wasn't determined to be anything. I just was going along for the ride.
I see.
You know, I really had no great plans, but I just knew that life was going to treat me well. I've always had this thing in the back of my mind that whatever I do, it's going to turn out all right, and it usually does turn out all right because I have this optimism about it.
Which is very important, to having things turning out right.
I think if you feel that way, you can make it happen. So I went to Paris, and when people said, "What do?" I said, "I'm a writer," because that's easy to say. And most of us over there were either writers or painters. That's what we said we were. But I was slightly ambitious, and I didn't want to just sit around the left bank and talk about Proust and all that stuff. So I started stringing for Variety. As a stringer is somebody who contributes and gets paid by space. And I was working as a leg man for Variety in Paris, which gave me an entree to restaurants, nightclubs, and everything. And then I noticed...
How'd you get that job on Variety?
Well, I met an old man named Maxime Debex, who was the Variety correspondent, but he was a little old and he couldn't move around too much. So I was the leg man for Maxime Debex, which is about as low as you can get to be a stringer who's a leg man for a stringer. But it was fun. And one of those columns, I know I got about $8, and it took an awful lot of words to fill one of those Variety columns. But then I noticed that the Paris Herald Tribune didn't have a nightclub column or was covering showbiz. So I went in and asked the managing editor if I could do it, and he threw me out. He says, "We don't need you." And then I heard he had gone back to the United States on a trip, so I sneaked back in and saw the editor of the magazine, who hired me. And when the managing editor came back, I was sitting there at a desk. And for a month or so, he was miffed at me, but then he got over it.
What kind of column was it when you started?
I started writing about nightclubs and restaurants and reviewing films. And I didn't know anything about any of those subjects.
But you had optimism.
Huh?
But you had optimism.
Well, everybody eats, you know, and I just faked it as far as food went. I faked it as far as wine went. But after a while, you get to know what's good and what's bad. And the nightclub scene, I was writing it in kind of a humorous way, and that's the only place we had topless in those days was in Paris. And so that was very naughty to write about topless. And the people came all the way from the United States to see topless at the Folies Bergère and at the Lido. And that was really, that was wild stuff.
Is it true that you almost got fired after writing the first 4 or 5 columns?
I don't know if that's true or not. There's so much legend mixed up with fact that I really don't know. I was only getting $25 a week, and I wasn't on the staff. I was sort of a contributor, so I don't think, you know, I was in that much danger. But I could have been.
Well, the story I thought was a marvelous story, that knowing you might be fired, you sort of went loose and wrote with a don't give a damn attitude, and it proved to be the style that you developed thereafter.
Well, that's a good legend. I don't think
true.
it's true because I have never given a damn in terms of my writing as far as subject matter, and I've gotten away with it. And I think that's, I don't know if I changed my style because of being threatened. I was never threatened about being fired. But when you start out on a paper, obviously you're going to be a little more careful until they get to know who you are.
Sure, sure. I understand you're not much of a drinker, and yet
No, I don't drink.
and don't care too much for nightclubs, and yet that was the beat that you put yourself on.
Well, I figured if that's what they wanted, I'd give it to them. You know, I mean, it's not the worst life in the world, but you don't want to do it forever. And then I was dating at the time, and it was a good way to take a girl to a nightclub.
What about setting out to eat in all the best restaurants in Paris? Was that true, or is that a legend?
That I set out to eat?
No, not that you set out to eat, because you've obviously done that, but rather that you set out to visit all of the best restaurants in Paris, some 5,000 of them.
Well, yeah, I imagine I did. I don't know if I set out to eat at all of them, but I did a pretty good job. What happened was people would tout me on the restaurants. After I started writing the column, I would get letters from people saying, you ought to try this place. This guy's fantastic. It's his wife and his son and his mother, and they run this little place, and they have the greatest frog legs in the world. Well, I had to eat twice a day, lunch and dinner, so I would cover 2 restaurants a day, and I found some great ones, and I put out a book called Paris After Dark, and then I changed it to Art Buchwald's Secret List of Paris, and we sold about 200,000 copies, and people used to use it as a Bible. And I had all the restaurants there according to price and according to what they were. And I must say it was a darn good list.
Your column, of course, was syndicated in America after it had been published
1952.
after some years in the Paris Herald Tribune. But it's been said that you really became well known at the point where you wrote the story about Jim Haggerty and his press conferences.
Yeah,
with President Eisenhower.
what happened is I was over there and I was Peck's bad boy, and I just did a very funny takeoff on a Haggerty press briefing because nothing was happening, and he was briefing the press on Eisenhower's health and how many blankets did he have on his bed, Jim, and what was his temperature. So I did a spoof on a Haggerty press briefing, but it sounded so much like the real thing that the next morning Haggerty called a press conference to deny it. And he had no news that morning, and he spent the entire press briefing attacking me. Well, nobody had heard of me, you know, and all of a sudden, here's the press secretary of the President of the United States who is picking me out of everybody and saying he's a liar and a thief and whatever. And it really helped me around the world because people suddenly got my name spelled right. And I've always been grateful to Haggerty for that.
After 13 years, Art, you came to Washington.
In 1962.
Why did you leave Paris? And
I had done as much as I wanted to do over there. I didn't want to become an expatriate. Life was good. But, you know, when you're writing humor, you have to have a lot of abrasive forces working for you. And there weren't any working for me. I had it made over there. I was the mayor of Paris as far as Americans were concerned. And life was so easy for me that I knew that I just couldn't keep it up. So I came back to Washington on a lecture tour, and I came to Washington when Kennedy was in the White House, and it seemed like such a fantastic place. I said, I think I'm going to take a crack at this for a couple of years and see if I like it. Well, I did like it, and it was a different type of column. I wasn't doing political stuff from Europe.
Yeah.
and I started doing it here.
Were you all apprehensive about changing the nature
I
of the
wasn't,
column?
the reader was.
Oh.
Everybody predicted that I would fall on my face because they said, well, he's a big fish in Europe, but when he comes back to Washington, he's going to, you know, he's got some real big professionals to go up against. And I said, the heck with them. But it's very hard for the reader to adjust to me this change of scene. And I've always said, once the reader got adjusted to it, then it was easy for me. But I never had any apprehensions about it.
And you've never lacked for abrasive forces?
No, life goes, it's a wild place. It's a satirist dream, Washington. You couldn't invent Washington any better than it is.
It's like a fantasy land. from your point of
Disneyland
view.
North, or whatever you want to call it. And every day you pick up the paper, and it's your day is made. You don't even have to work hard.
You do not, as most Washington writers, do not mingle with the politicians of Washington.
No.
Why is that?
Well, they confuse you. You know, they're all nice people, and you don't want to know them well, and they tell you things that aren't true, but they tell it in such a nice way that you sort of take their word for it. And I feel, doing satire, that I have to get the same things from the newspapers and TV that the average reader does, or the average viewer gets, so I can comment on it. For example, rather than go to a Nixon press conference, I'd rather see it on TV, because I am going to see what the people at home saw, rather than, if I see it differently at the White House, it isn't going to help me in my satire, because I'm commenting on something that's already happened that people know about. And I don't find any sources of information worth anything to me. And I think this is true of any satirist or cartoonist. He doesn't need to talk to people.
Why is that?
Because you're commenting on things that happen, and you're not going for information. If I got the greatest scoop in the world, if I got the Operation Gemstone folder, and I could prove that President Nixon was involved in Watergate, nobody would believe me. I'd have to turn it over to somebody who was a straight reporter. So why go for news?
Do you ever have a problem of people taking you seriously?
Oh, sure. 10, 15, 20% sometimes. And that doesn't bother me at all, because, you know, I'm in a newspaper, and I used to answer letters when people, but now I'm getting sort of sore about answering mail. So now I have a new letter that I send people, and I say, "Dear Mrs. Braverman, due to the postal rate hike, Mr. Buchwald is unable to answer your letter." And then I have my secretary sign it.
Have you ever had reactions from presidents from your column?
No, no, I don't hear from anybody. Not in the White House. I went to USC, so a lot of the Nixon people went to USC. So every time I see them in a restaurant or somewhere, I bring up the Trojans and what a great football team we have.
I see.
And I use the old school tie.
Yeah. I want to take you back to Paris for just a moment. You said that in some context that you never wanted to become a Paris character because it took too much liquor, among other things.
Well, I thought of Sparrow Robertson. There was a guy named Sparrow Robertson who was there in the 30s and the 20s and 30s, and he became a Paris character. I didn't want to, you know, and I think that, you know, you don't want to become a character. You don't want to become a parody or anything. And that's why I moved. I think if you stay too long, you'd become a character. And I just, it's not a bad thing, but I just didn't want to do it.
Yes. What about becoming a character here?
Well, that's very dangerous. You have to watch it all the time, that you don't become a character. And as long as the news is what it is, I'm not the character. The White House is the character, and the president's the character. I'm not the character.
Does your optimism, Art, or your optimism about yourself extend to what you're satirizing, in this case, the politics of this country?
Yeah, I'm an optimist about everything. I think Watergate is the best thing that's happened to this country.
Why?
Because we can look at ourselves for the first time. People are interested in the government for the first time. They're interested in the Constitution. Everyone's become a lawyer. Everybody goes to the law books now, to the Constitution. We are looking at ourselves and saying, hey, wait a minute. Who are these people that are running our lives? And if that comes out of Watergate, that's the greatest thing in the world. And coming at the 200th anniversary of our country, if we can decide that we're not just going to accept verbatim everything we're told by people in the White House or on the Hill. I think it's the greatest thing that's happened to America. I have never seen so many people who are so interested in Washington as they are now. And 4 years ago, you couldn't get anyone to be interested in what their government was doing to them.
Yeah. Do you have any apprehensions at all about the fact that you're satirizing of these things, making them look ridiculous, or showing how they look ridiculous without your making it so, might bring about any kind of a cynicism on the part of people who say, you know, if it's that funny, it can't be serious?
No, I don't have any apprehensions about that. I don't worry about that. I don't worry about the effect of the column, because if I did, it'd be a bore. I just write for myself. I have a certain amount of hostility every day, which I have to get out of me. And I sit down 3 times a week. I'll write about seatbelts. I've got a thing against seatbelts. Or I'll write about Watergate. And as long as I can get out of my system, I'm happy. And I don't worry that there's going to create a cynicism, or that I know I can't change much, but I don't worry about anything.
You don't worry about anything?
No.
Where do you get all these hostilities?
From my childhood.
There's still 3 times a week, still
Oh, yeah.
a mind there to be...
Oh, yeah. I'm a very hostile person underneath this beautiful smile I have.
Very hard to believe, very hard to believe, but I think as long as you keep the rest of us smiling, why, we won't care how hostile you are.
No, but I don't think it's a bad thing. I think hostility, if you use it for a good purpose, is fine.
Thank you so much, Art.
You bet.